When did your ex's custody fight backfire so badly they lost all parental rights permanently? The process server handed me the papers on a Wednesday morning while my daughter Lily was eating breakfast. I signed for the envelope and closed the door before opening it, not wanting her to see my hands shaking as I read the petition. My ex-husband Trevor was suing for full custody of our 6-year-old daughter, claiming I was an unfit mother who had alienated her from him and created an unsafe environment. The allegations were detailed and devastating. He claimed I'd been coaching Lily to lie about him, that I'd neglected her medical care, that I had substance abuse problems, and that I'd introduced dangerous men into her life. Every single accusation was a fabrication, but they were written with such specific detail that someone who didn't know me might believe them. I'd been divorced from Trevor for 3 years after leaving him when his controlling behavior escalated to pushing me during an argument. Our custody arrangement gave me primary custody with him getting every other weekend and Wednesday dinners. It had been working fine until 6 months ago when he started dating Kimberly, a woman who apparently had strong opinions about how I was raising our daughter, and had convinced Trevor he needed to fight for full custody. I called my lawyer Nina Alvarez immediately and read her the petition over the phone. She was silent for a long moment before asking if any of the allegations had even a grain of truth. I told her no. I'd never used drugs in my life. Lily was current on all her vaccinations and doctor visits. I hadn't dated anyone seriously since the divorce, and I'd never said anything negative about Trevor to Lily despite having plenty of reasons. Nina said we'd need to prove all of that and more because family courts took these allegations seriously even when they were clearly retaliatory. She asked if I had documentation of Lily's medical records, character references, anything that could demonstrate I was a stable parent. I said yes to the medical records, but felt my stomach sink, realizing I'd have to ask people to testify about my fitness as a mother. The humiliation of defending myself against lies felt suffocating. Nina scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week and told me to start gathering evidence. I spent the rest of that day pulling together 3 years of pediatric records, report cards showing Lily's excellent attendance and progress, and photos of our life together that showed a happy, well-adjusted child. Every piece of evidence felt necessary and insulting at the same time. Trevor's lawyer had requested an emergency temporary custody modification, claiming Lily was in immediate danger with me. The judge granted him extra visitation time pending the hearing, which meant I had to send my daughter to stay with her father for 3 days that week instead of the normal 2. Lily cried when I told her, asking why she had to go to Daddy's house when it wasn't her regular weekend. I couldn't explain that her father was trying to take her away from me permanently, so I told her it was just a special visit and she'd be home soon. Dropping her off at Trevor's apartment felt like cutting off my own arm. He came to the door with Kimberly standing behind him, both of them wearing expressions of fake concern. Trevor said something about hoping I'd use this time to get help with my problems. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood and kissed Lily goodbye. That night, I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and imagining all the ways this could go wrong. Family court was notoriously unpredictable. Mothers usually got custody, but not always. And Trevor had money from his finance job to hire expensive lawyers while I worked as a teacher, making a third of his salary. The power imbalance was obvious and terrifying. The preliminary hearing happened in a windowless courtroom that smelled like old carpet and desperation. Trevor sat across the aisle with Kimberly and his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance Moore, who had a reputation for winning ugly custody battles. Nina presented our evidence showing Lily's medical care was current, my employment was stable, and I had no criminal record or substance abuse history. Constance argued that those were just surface-level facts that didn't address the emotional abuse and parental alienation I'd allegedly committed. She called Trevor to testify. He sat in the witness box wearing an expensive suit and put on a performance about how worried he'd been watching Lily become withdrawn and anxious after visits with me. He claimed she'd started saying things about not wanting to go back to Mommy's house, that she'd mentioned being hungry at my house and being left alone. Every word was a lie delivered with practiced sincerity. When Nina cross-examined him and asked for specific dates and details of these concerning incidents, he provided them. July 15th, when Lily had supposedly told him she'd had nothing but cereal for dinner for 3 days straight. August 2nd, when she'd allegedly said I'd left her alone to go to a party. September 10th, when she'd cried about being scared at my house. I frantically wrote notes for Nina showing that July 15th had been the week we'd had family visiting and I'd cooked elaborate meals every night. August 2nd, I'd been at a required school training, not a party, and my sister had stayed with Lily. September 10th was Lily's first day of school, and she'd been anxious about that, not about being home. But Trevor had an answer for everything. He suggested my family would cover for me, that my sister might not be aware of my problems, that Lily's school anxiety could stem from instability at home. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Pamela Reeves, listened with an expression that gave nothing away. When it was my turn to testify, I explained each discrepancy and provided documentation. Nina showed the judge photos from the family visit in July, the training certificate from August, Lily's school enrollment forms from September. Constance objected to almost every piece of evidence, arguing they didn't prove what happened in my home when no one was watching. She asked me directly if I'd ever spoken negatively about Trevor to Lily. I said no. She asked if I'd ever prevented Lily from calling her father. I said no. He had my number and could call whenever he wanted. She asked if I had any romantic partners. I said I'd been on a few dates over 3 years, but nothing serious, and never introduced anyone to Lily. Constance then produced phone records showing I'd been texting frequently with someone named Daniel. She asked if that was one of the dates I'd mentioned. My face went hot because Daniel was my neighbor, a divorced dad whose daughter was Lily's best friend. We texted about playdates and school pickups. I explained this, but Constance made it sound suspicious, suggesting I was lying about my relationship status. Judge Reeves ordered a custody evaluation to be completed by a court-appointed psychologist before making any decisions. She maintained the temporary expanded visitation for Trevor pending the evaluation results. I left the courthouse feeling demolished. Nina tried to be encouraging, saying the judge was just being thorough, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The custody evaluator was a man named Dr. Marcus Griffin, who scheduled separate interviews with me, Trevor, and Lily over the next 2 weeks. I met with Dr. Griffin in his office that smelled like mint tea and anxiety. He asked hundreds of questions about my parenting style, my relationship with Trevor, my childhood, my mental health, my daily routine with Lily. I answered honestly, trying not to sound defensive even though every question felt accusatory. He asked about the allegations in Trevor's petition, and I explained they were false. He made notes without revealing whether he believed me. When he interviewed Lily, I wasn't allowed to be present. I waited in the lobby for 90 minutes, imagining what questions he was asking my 6-year-old daughter and what she might say. When Lily came out, she looked tired and confused. She asked why the doctor wanted to know about Mommy and Daddy. I told her he was just trying to help, which was a lie that tasted bitter. 2 weeks later, I got Dr. Griffin's report. It was 30 pages of clinical language and psychological assessment. The summary recommended maintaining primary custody with me, but increasing Trevor's visitation to include one overnight during the week in addition to alternating weekends. The report noted that Lily appeared well-adjusted and bonded with both parents, that there was no evidence of abuse or neglect, and that Trevor's allegations appeared to be unfounded. I felt relief wash over me reading those words. Nina said this was a good outcome, that we should agree to the increased visitation to show cooperation with the court. I agreed, even though losing an extra night with Lily felt like a punishment for Trevor's lies. But at least I'd maintain primary custody. The hearing to finalize the evaluation recommendations was scheduled for 3 weeks away. Trevor's response came 2 days later. He filed an appeal of Dr. Griffin's evaluation, claiming the evaluator was biased and had failed to properly investigate the allegations. He requested a second evaluation by a different psychologist. Constance attached declarations from 3 of Trevor's friends claiming they'd witnessed concerning behavior from me at various times. One said I'd seemed intoxicated at a school event. Another said they'd seen me yelling at Lily in a parking lot. A third claimed Lily had told them she didn't like being at Mommy's house. I read those declarations feeling sick. The school event had been 2 years ago, and I'd had exactly 2 glasses of wine over 3 hours. I'd never yelled at Lily in public, and none of these people had ever expressed concern to me directly if they'd actually witnessed something wrong. Nina said this was a common tactic, flooding the court with declarations to create doubt even when the declarations were exaggerated or false. We'd need counter-declarations from people who could speak to my character and parenting. I started reaching out to friends, family, other parents from Lily's school. Most people were happy to help, but a few became uncomfortable when I explained I needed them to write statements for a custody battle. One friend said she didn't want to get involved in anything legal. Another said she didn't feel comfortable taking sides between parents. Each rejection felt personal, even though I understood their reluctance. I ended up with declarations from my sister, 2 close friends, Lily's teacher, and my neighbor Daniel, who wrote about the many times he'd seen me being patient and loving with Lily. Nina said it would have to be enough. Judge Reeves denied Trevor's request for a second evaluation, stating that Dr. Griffin's assessment was thorough, and there was no evidence of bias. She scheduled a final hearing to issue custody orders based on the evaluation recommendations. The night before the final hearing, Trevor called me for the first time in months. His voice was cold when he said we needed to talk about what was best for Lily. I said the court evaluation had already determined what was best. He said the evaluation was flawed and he had new evidence that would prove I was unfit. I asked what evidence, and he said I'd find out in court. The threat hung between us until I told him not to contact me directly and hung up. I couldn't sleep that night, turning over every possible thing he might present. When morning came, I dressed in my most conservative outfit and drove to the courthouse with my stomach churning. Nina met me outside looking grim. She said Constance had filed a last-minute supplemental motion that morning, including new evidence. She handed me the papers. Trevor was now claiming that Lily had disclosed to him during a recent visit that I'd left her alone overnight while I went on a date with Daniel. That Lily had been scared and called him crying, but he couldn't come get her because I wouldn't answer my phone. That this proved I was putting my social life ahead of my daughter's safety and lying to the court about my relationships. Every word was fabricated. I'd never left Lily alone for even an hour, much less overnight. I'd never been on a date with Daniel, and Lily had never called Trevor crying about anything. Nina immediately filed a response stating these allegations were demonstrably false and requesting the court sanction Trevor for filing frivolous claims. But we had to address them in the hearing. When we walked into the courtroom, Trevor was already seated with Kimberly and Constance. He wouldn't look at me. Judge Reeves called the hearing to order, and Constance immediately moved to present Trevor's new evidence. The judge looked annoyed but allowed it. Trevor took the stand and testified about Lily's phone call. He said it had happened 3 weeks ago on a Saturday night. He'd been at dinner with Kimberly when his phone rang, and Lily was hysterical, saying she was alone and scared and couldn't find Mommy. He said he'd tried to call me multiple times, but I hadn't answered. He'd considered calling the police, but eventually Lily had calmed down and said I'd come home. Constance presented phone records showing calls from Trevor's number to mine at the time and date he'd specified. She also played a voicemail recording of Trevor saying he was trying to reach me about Lily being upset. I felt my heart racing because I remembered that night clearly. 3 weeks ago on a Saturday, Lily had been at Trevor's house for his weekend visit. I'd been home alone catching up on grading papers. My phone had been on silent, but I'd seen the missed calls from Trevor and assumed he was trying to stir up problems, so I hadn't called back immediately. When Nina cross-examined Trevor, she asked him to clarify whether Lily had been at his house or mine that weekend. He said she'd been at mine. Nina pulled up the custody calendar showing that had been his parenting weekend. She asked how Lily could have called him from my house when she was supposed to be with him. Trevor's face went red, and he said he must have confused the date. Constance requested a recess to confer with her client. Judge Reeves denied it and told Trevor to continue. Nina asked him directly where Lily had been that Saturday night. Trevor stammered that she'd been with him, but had told him about a previous incident of being left alone. Nina asked when that previous incident had occurred. Trevor couldn't provide a date. Nina asked if he had any evidence besides his own testimony that Lily had ever been left alone at my house. He said Lily had told him. Nina asked if he'd reported this alleged neglect to Child Protective Services. He said no because he'd been trying to handle it through the custody case. Nina asked why he'd wait 3 weeks to mention something so serious. Trevor said he'd been gathering evidence. Judge Reeves interrupted and asked Trevor if he was aware that filing false allegations in court was perjury. Trevor's lawyer jumped in saying her client believed these allegations were true based on what his daughter told him. Judge Reeves was not impressed. The judge called a recess and requested both lawyers meet her in chambers. I sat in the courtroom with my hands shaking while Trevor avoided looking at me. 20 minutes later, the lawyers returned and Judge Reeves took the bench. Her expression was severe when she said she'd reviewed all the evidence and testimony carefully. She noted that Trevor's allegations had been inconsistent and unsupported by documentation. She said the custody evaluation had found no evidence of neglect or abuse. She said the pattern of accusations followed by contradictions suggested Trevor was not being truthful with the court. She ordered primary custody to remain with me and denied any expansion of Trevor's visitation. She said she was concerned about Trevor's judgment and his willingness to make unsubstantiated allegations. She ordered that his visitation would continue as originally established but would be subject to review if any further false allegations were filed. Constance tried to argue, but Judge Reeves cut her off. The judge said she took allegations of child neglect seriously and would not tolerate parents who weaponized the court system. Trevor's face had gone from red to pale. I felt a wave of relief, but also wariness because I knew Trevor wouldn't accept this outcome quietly. For 6 months, things were relatively calm. Trevor followed the custody schedule and stopped filing motions. Lily seemed happy and adjusted well to the routine. Then Trevor violated the custody order by not returning Lily after his weekend visit. He texted me Sunday evening saying Lily had asked to stay with him for the week, and he'd agreed because he wanted to honor her wishes. I called him and said he needed to bring her home immediately per the court order. He said no. He said Lily was safe and happy with him, and he'd bring her to school the next morning. I called Nina, who filed an emergency motion for contempt. The police couldn't help because it was a civil custody matter. I spent the night unable to sleep, imagining Lily confused about why she couldn't come home. The next morning, Trevor did drop Lily at school, but when I went to pick her up, she was gone. The school said her father had checked her out early for a doctor's appointment. I called Trevor and he didn't answer. I called the police and they said without an Amber Alert they couldn't do anything. Nina got an emergency hearing scheduled for the next day. Trevor didn't show up. Judge Reeves issued a warrant for contempt and ordered police to retrieve Lily and return her to me. It took 3 days to find them. Trevor had taken Lily to Kimberly's parents' house 2 states away. Police recovered Lily and she was brought home by Child Protective Services. Lily was traumatized. She cried and said Daddy had told her Mommy didn't want her anymore, and they were going on an adventure. She'd been scared and confused and wanted to come home. I held her while she sobbed and felt rage toward Trevor that was almost blinding. Nina immediately filed a motion to modify custody based on Trevor's violation of court orders and parental kidnapping. The hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Trevor was arrested for contempt of court and posted bail. His defense was that he'd been acting in Lily's best interest because she'd expressed fear about returning to me. When asked why Lily would fear returning to her mother, Trevor said I'd been getting increasingly unstable and he'd been worried. Judge Reeves asked for any evidence of this instability. Trevor said Lily's words were evidence. The judge ordered Lily to be interviewed by a child psychologist to determine if she'd actually expressed fear about being with me or if she'd been coached. The psychologist, Dr. Laura Chen, spent 3 sessions with Lily. Her report was damning for Trevor. Dr. Chen noted that Lily showed signs of parental alienation, specifically that she repeated phrases about Mommy that seemed scripted and inconsistent with her affect when discussing me. When asked direct questions about whether she was scared of me, Lily said no and became confused, saying Daddy had told her to say that. Dr. Chen concluded that Trevor had been coaching Lily to make negative statements about me and that the abduction had been traumatic for the child. Judge Reeves scheduled another hearing specifically to address Trevor's contempt and the custody modification. This time, the judge's demeanor was entirely different. She started by stating that Trevor had willfully violated her custody order, had abducted his child across state lines, and had coached the child to make false statements about the other parent. She said these actions demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for the court and for his daughter's well-being. Trevor's lawyer tried to argue that he'd been acting out of concern for his daughter, but Judge Reeves cut her off. The judge said that if Trevor had genuine concerns, he had legal means to address them. Instead, he'd chosen to violate court orders and traumatize his child. She said this pattern of behavior going back to the original custody filing showed Trevor was willing to lie and manipulate to get what he wanted without consideration for how it affected Lily. Constance argued that terminating custody would harm the child by removing her father. Judge Reeves said Trevor had already harmed his child through his actions, and that Lily's safety and stability had to be the priority. She suspended all of Trevor's custody and visitation rights pending a fitness hearing. Trevor stood up and shouted that this was wrong, that I'd manipulated everyone, that the system was biased against fathers. A bailiff moved toward him and his lawyer pulled him back down. The fitness hearing happened 6 weeks later. The burden was on Trevor to prove he should maintain any parental rights. Nina argued that his pattern of false allegations, violation of court orders, parental alienation, and kidnapping demonstrated he was a danger to Lily's emotional well-being. We presented evidence of every false allegation he'd made, every hearing where he'd been found to be lying, and Dr. Chen's report showing Lily had been traumatized by his coaching and the abduction. Trevor's defense was that he'd made mistakes out of love for his daughter. Constance brought in a psychologist who testified that children need both parents and that terminating parental rights should be a last resort. Nina cross-examined the psychologist and asked if children benefit from parents who lie to them, coach them to make false allegations, and kidnap them. The psychologist had to admit no. We also presented evidence that Trevor had violated the restraining conditions of his release by attempting to contact me and showing up near Lily's school. Judge Reeves took 3 days to issue her ruling. When we returned to court, she read from a lengthy decision that outlined Trevor's entire history of misconduct. She noted that he'd been given multiple opportunities to correct his behavior and had instead escalated. She said his actions showed he was incapable of putting Lily's needs ahead of his own desire to control the custody situation. Judge Reeves terminated Trevor's parental rights permanently, stating that maintaining any relationship with him would continue to cause Lily psychological harm. Trevor lost it in the courtroom. He screamed that I'd destroyed his relationship with his daughter, that the system was corrupt, that he'd fight this forever. Security removed him. His lawyer filed an immediate appeal, but it was denied. The termination was final. I walked out of that courthouse with Lily's hand in mine and felt something between relief and sadness. Relief that she was safe, sadness that her father had done this to himself and to her. 2 years later, Lily is thriving. She's in therapy processing the trauma, but she's happy and hasn't asked about Trevor in months. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Kimberly broke up and he moved to another state. Sometimes I wonder if he understands what he lost or if he still blames everyone but himself. Mostly I focus on giving Lily the stable, loving home she deserves. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.